However he was positioned to get that wound, they all agree he got it on the ground. So whether or not he was moved would make no difference, because their own experts on the point in issue make clear that he got the wound on the ground. But let's talk about whether or not he was moved. And before we do, let's go to the other two defendants and their role in this. McMillan and Carroll indicate that they shoot from this close distance. And by the way, A could have been, as we said, could have been inflicted right then when he's on the left with a perfect view of the chest, because really, in common sense, are we going to really believe that an individual is going to put their chest up when they're being fired at, or are they going to try to protect themselves if they possibly can? So very clearly may have inflicted A. Some shots may have missed. They may have scrambled down, as they said, given time for the pause, just as witnesses said happened. And if they did, then of course they had that time for reflection. But when they backed down, what do officers Boss and Murphy say? What do they say they saw? Because when you listen to what they said they saw, I suggest you're going to find that that's inconsistent with the evidence too. And you're going to reject their testimony for that reason. They said that when these officers, McMillan and Carroll, come down, there is now an open field and they can see Mr. Diallo. They have told you, they all told you, that the lighting was dim. They've got Barrow to come in here and testify he needed his flashlight to see around the vestibule. That was their witness, who they just commented favorably about before a little bit ago in the summation. Barrow said he needed a flashlight. These two defendants now say that when Mr. Diallo was in the back of the vestibule, they could see him. They didn't need a flashlight. The light was good enough for that, but it doesn't stop there. Defendant Boss says that he sees the defendant with his back against the wall. His knees are bent. His back is straight. His arm is out. In the dim light, he sees not only this, but he sees an object in his hand. By the dim light, he sees the object is a gun, and by the dim light, he sees the gun is black. Suddenly, the light is bright enough to see all of those things. The light was bright enough for him to detect all of this. But this is inconsistent with the evidence. Do you really believe that even if medically possible, that a person could have his hand out? Do you see any explanation in any of the evidence? You heard Mr. Worth talk about the science of it all and the medicine of it all. Well, where in the science of it all and the medicine of it all do you find that Mr. Diallo now got himself in what sounds like a combat stance with his knees bent and his hand out and his back straight when the man is unquestionably a paraplegic? If not from A, from G. And his back is against the wall, so he can't get G after this. And once he gets into this stance, can any of you explain to me how his knees would allow him to go down on the ground when he gets there and fling his leg over? Either one over the other. How did that happen? Where's the science of that story? He couldn't have crossed his legs. Forget wound A being first, last, or midway. Forget G being here, there, or elsewhere. He got wound S when he was down. However he was positioned, he got it. Because he got it. The experts all agree he got it on the ground. However he happened to do that, he did. That's what's important. But he couldn't have crossed his legs when he's a paraplegic. He couldn't have changed his position. He couldn't suddenly become in a combat stance. And when he slid out of the combat stance, because apparently he had glue on his shoes that was holding him up, when he finally slid out of that stance, how does he slide out of it? How does he slide out of it with his knees bent and his legs go out from under him, and suddenly his legs are crossed? So they say, we have no evidence that the body was moved. Dr. Cohn suggested the body had to be moved to be in that position. They had to be in the position to get the wound in the leg. So, is there any reason to move the body? How about, where's the fucking gun? Where's the fucking gun? Where's the effing gun? That's what they said. They couldn't believe there was no gun. Several of them commented on it. Defendant Murphy said he was out in the street. He couldn't believe it. And I'm not doubting that they were shocked. Whether they shot him on the motion or shot him for a wallet or whatever, they had to be horrified. There's no gun. They shot a man they never had a reason to believe had a gun. The fact that they were upset afterwards, that shouldn't surprise us. We're not demonizing these people for all purposes, for all times. They were mighty unreasonable. They treated this man with no dignity and respect, but after the fact, they realized what they'd done. And that doesn't undo what they did. So they're asking, where's the gun? Where's the gun? Do you believe that all they did was just look at the body and ask themselves where the gun and never try to find it? Never look, however quickly, whatever it took? I'm not suggesting for half a second they were trying to conform their position of the body to rebut an argument by Dr. Cohn. That's nonsense. I'm saying they're looking for the gun because they want to find a gun. I don't know whether the inconsistency in the evidence from these defendants is intentional distortion or wishful thinking. But wishful thinking, at some point, we can all understand. And I'm sure for a lot of reasons they were wishing there was a gun there. And can any of you believe that they weren't going to look for it? That they would just accept the fact that the wallet that they say they saw in his hand, that put the end to it. That they're going to say, where's the fucking gun? Two of them. Carroll said he said it. Boss said he said it. The same words. And Murphy outside wandering around, wondering what happened to it, and who knows what McMillan's thinking. And that they didn't do anything at all to find it? To move him, to roll him, to turn him? Not to change the body to conform to a crime scene diagram, but to find a gun they desperately wanted to find. And for them to deny that that's reasonable, that's just over the line. That means that virtually everything that the defense has maintained here has been unreasonable. To refuse to accept the reason of people in their position looking for a gun, even if it takes moving a body, is to just to be in denial and to defy all reason. And that's their theme. That's their theme. Reason has gone out the window. And it really is important that we bring it back. And when Defendant Murphy, he saw Amadeo Diallo claim that his hand was out, knees bent, the same posture. How? And how did four individuals in this dim light all conclude together? How did they all reach the same distorted view that this wallet was a gun? Doesn't that seem just a little too pat? That these four individuals all concluded that from various positions in the lighting they claim to be dim. Now, given the manner in which they've treated this man, that they now all seeing that this wallet, and they see it in a gun as a gun, and they see it with such detail at the same time that they're saying the light is dim. And him, with his having the knees bent. It's the same thing. If you find any witnesses incredible about one thing, you can reject everything they say. Well, he's got him too, in a position that would not explain how he ended up as he did. In fact, Dr. Cohn, who is so maligned, you can definitely, with the position that he was in, trying to figure this out in the beginning without the benefit of any testimony, I think he did remarkably well. But all he was doing really was trying to tell you what happened to the body. And he did conclude that wound A must have come early on for a reason that you can all understand. The blood pressure in his aorta, when that arch ruptured, he lost more than 2 quarts of blood. And with that loss of blood, he lost his pressure. And these defendants say this whole incident took seconds. Well, you heard the other witnesses, including their own, Levon Clark, who said it took 10 to 15 seconds. And what did Dr. Mason tell you, or Dr. Fackler, about when maybe time would become significant? It would be about then. But they can't accuse us of putting words in our mouth because they called it. And we didn't know what Dr. Mason, Dr. Fackler would say. 10 or 15 seconds. So the simplest, most direct explanation, you heard a term, I never heard it before, Occam's razor. You look for the simplest explanation. Well, isn't the simplest explanation for the no hemorrhage in all of these wounds, or the very slight or unusual amount of hemorrhage? Dr. Cohen didn't say it was the first, he said it was one of the first. And wouldn't the explanation for that be the drop in blood pressure? Because that explains why these wounds don't have any bleeding. And that's consistent with Edward McMillan firing at that point, or the way that Sean Carroll was over on the other side, firing at the body. And you remember when Sean Carroll described the incident? And ask yourselves if this is credible. These two men are in there at point blank range shooting, and Carroll has Mr. Diallo in the left side of the vestibule, going over to the right side of the vestibule, behind the vestibule door, and then going back to the other side of the vestibule. Well, all of this firing is going along. Well, they fired their initial barrage from only feet away. Well, if he's actually running around like that, when did he get wound A, which would have paralyzed him? When did he get wound G, which would have paralyzed him? More consistently, he took the wound A, and then he was framed that way. His left side was exposed, and because he couldn't move his legs, that's why you see the string of wounds going down his left side. Because he couldn't move to get away from them. He wasn't ping-ponging back and forth across the vestibule like a moving target. Because if he was, how would he have ever explained anybody's view of this? I suggest to you that just was completely at odds with the evidence. And I don't know where in the world anybody could think that's consistent with. Just going back and forth. More consistent is that he was shot, that he was then hit along the left side, and because his legs were paralyzed, he couldn't do anything to help himself. And then when he eventually went down, and that, of course, how he suddenly turned himself around and presented at that point, the defense certainly hasn't explained, but they want to put him in a position where his arm is going to be extended and he's in a combat crouch, and he's holding out this wallet. In his last desperate death throes, he's holding out his wallet, and they're seeing it as a gun, and he's in a position that they think explains what they're saying. And then they forget about the lower half of his body, and the fact that his knees are bent, and he's in a crouch, and they can't explain that, because they approached the whole thing piecemeal. The same way they approached him. He was objectified. They saw what they thought was somebody that was doing something awfully wrong, and that's how they approached him. And they don't look at the whole picture. Well, the whole picture is a whole man, and this whole man was shot, and then he fell. And when he landed on the ground, he was shot again. Now, you heard Edward McMillan talk about, and Sean Carroll talk about how he flew out of the vestibule. They're the same people that told us that Dr. Fackler did away with the Hollywood version of how people get shot, how they're blown backwards. But they'd have you believe Edward McMillan was blown backwards. They couldn't tell the difference between him backpedaling, if he did that, if he fell, and Sheree Elliott said he didn't. She saw nobody fall. How do they explain that? How do they explain him flying out, and that Sean Carroll is supposed to believe, or any of the other two up front, based on the evidence here?
Objection, Your Honor. There's no testimony that Mr. McMillan was shot.
Sustained. Confine yourself to the evidence in this case. Your statement's stricken.
When Richard Murphy testified, he testified that he did not, when he finished firing, shots continued. Edward McMillan said the same thing, and so did Kenneth Boss. That would leave only Sean Carroll. And he said he definitely wasn't the last to fire. And when Officer Murphy testified, he testified that he heard, quote, numerous shots, which he then went on to explain were more than one or two. Well, that could be three. And that would exactly explain the number of wounds that Dr. Cohn found would be consistent with being shot while on the ground. You just put up equals 3, 25, 3. Wound N in the left shin. Wound R through the bottom of the right third toe. And wound S that went up his leg and is Sean Carroll's bullet. Richard Murphy confirmed there were more than one or two shots after the other firing ended. And you know from the experts that when Mr. Diallo went down, he sustained the wound in his leg. He was shot while he was down 3 times, according to this evidence. And if he's shot while he's down, he's down. There's no longer any threat whatever. And it's consistent. Dr. Cohn called that. And you heard from this defendant who testified after he did, perfectly consistent with his testimony. So that none of these defendants, in none of the things that they did, and none of the descriptions they gave you of their claims about the shooting and the need for it, none of that's reasonable. And I suggest to you that you'll find that much of it is not believable about the threat that all of them claim to have faced. Carroll and McMillan in the vestibule, and Murphy and Boss when they were on the street. And I don't know if counsel meant to minimize when he said he fired 5 times. 5 times. Well, maybe against 16 times, 5 doesn't seem so bad. But 5 times, 4 times, a 9mm bullet fired at a human being, it's a horrible thing. It's an awesome thing. And what's here is it's a terrible thing because there was no basis for it. None of the actions were reasonable. Not from Boss, not from Carroll, not from McMillan or Murphy. This is not easy to argue all of this to you. This is a terrible thing. But this is the fact. And I think as you look through this case, you'll see it. So now we're left with 3 questions. Are these defendants guilty of intentional murder? Yes, they are. Because their conscious purpose was to kill him when they fired at him. And you know how you know that? Because he had nowhere to go. He's in a little vestibule, and they are firing 41 total times into that little space. And as a general rule of law and common sense, presume to intend the natural consequences of your acts. And the natural consequences of acts, of firing, when you're aiming your pistol, as they admitted they did, at center mass, that's here. The natural consequence of that act is to kill. Now, they say they're trained to shoot to stop. But under the circumstances of this case, it turned into shooting to kill because they fired so many times from such a short distance, from so close, so many times, at a part of the body that was so vulnerable. And you saw the wound that was inflicted and the other wounds as well. Well, second question, are they guilty of depraved indifference murder? Yes, they are. Because that requires a depraved indifference to human life and the creation of a grave risk of death. And then being aware of that risk and disregarding it. Well, can there be any doubt about the risk to an individual standing in a vestibule, boxed in on 3 sides. The 4th side is where all the bullets are coming from. Each one of the defendants firing a shot that contributes to this barrage that leaves Mr. Diallo with nowhere to go. There's nowhere he could go. At any time, if he hadn't been hit, from the time the shooting went, another bullet came to occupy a space that might have been safe. So all of these shots fired into that vestibule, that grave risk of death, it was a depraved indifference because there was virtually no way. It would have taken a miracle for him to survive. And they had to be aware of that, and they obviously disregarded it. And finally, the question is, are they guilty of reckless endangerment? And that count is directed at the safety of the people in the building. And I ask you to remember, when you heard the evidence, you heard that 1 bullet, 2, went into the closet of the landlord's front apartment. You heard that a bullet went through the vestibule door and traveled and went above apartment 1R, which is where Amadeo lived with his roommates, and it lodged in the closet. And you also heard about the bullets that were found on the steps in the hallway. If anybody had come down during the course of this incident to hear what was going on down those steps, that bullet could have gone into them. Now, the defendants said this only took seconds, but we know from the amount of time where they were describing coming down the stairs, Sean Carroll articulating a thought in the vestibule. If you remember his testimony, he said, as he's shooting, what is this guy wanted for? What did he do? He tells you he formulated that thought. Well, it takes time to formulate thoughts. Too bad that's the thought he formulated, but he said he formulated a thought. Kenneth Barr said, I'm going to die. Richard Murphy said, I'm going to die. Edward McMillan says he's tumbling down steps, he's trying to get himself righted, and he's shooting. And there's scrambling and there's backing up. This didn't take 4 seconds. There's no way it took 4 seconds or anything like that. In fact, LaVon Clark, when she described the 10 to 15 seconds, is probably much closer. And in the time when the first shot occurred or the second, somebody could have popped down to look, and a bullet could have been their fate. So yes, reckless endangerment of the people in that building. Other consequences of these defendants' unreasonable acts. That's certainly a count they should be found guilty for as well. You've been extremely patient. And I hope that through discussion of the evidence, you'll see what I asked for in the beginning of this case. I said I would ask you to base your verdict on the evidence, and I do. And based on that evidence, I ask you to find these defendants guilty of their intentional, depraved, reckless, unreasonable, and unnecessary conduct that jeopardized the lives of Amadeo Diallo's neighbors and destroyed Amadeo Diallo's life. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've had a full day, and I think it'd be imprudent if I charged you at this late hour. We're going to recess until tomorrow morning at 9:15. At that time, when you're fresh, had a good night's sleep, I'm going to charge you on the law that you must apply in this case. In the meantime, do not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Do not evaluate any evidence. Do not deliberate. Do not investigate. Do not do any research. Do not visit any of the scenes that have been depicted here. Do not observe, read, or listen or watch any reports about this case at all. Have a nice evening. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:15.
So there it is, was about just almost exactly 2 hours of the closing argument presented by Eric Warner, the prosecutor in the Amadeo Diallo police shooting case, who presented a very forceful case, and in dramatic fashion, he opened by writing the numbers 4 and 1 on 2 separate pieces of paper. He said they symbolized 41 bullets, and he also said it symbolized 4 against 1. That is to say, 4 trained cops wearing protective vests armed against a defenseless Amadeo Diallo in the vestibule of his home, who never stood a chance. And he said from the actions of those officers, Diallo was doomed the minute they saw him, and he did a very effective job of getting inside their heads. And he said the cops' preconceptions painted Diallo as a serial rapist, as a push-in robber, a man who was behaving very suspiciously, and he said they were cops who were losing sight of Diallo's humanity. Now, Jeff Simmons has been following the trial for me from the very start, and Warner did a very effective job of picking apart all the key issues in the case that were presented, we thought, so well by the defense in their closing arguments.
And in under 2 hours, compared with the 3 hours, 3.25 hours spent just by the defense. Just let me give you some brief highlights for now. He focused on issues such as lighting, such as conflicting commands by the officers telling Amadeo Diallo, according to their testimony, don't move and show us your hands. Talked about how the officers made many prejudgments that night, and also made very quick judgments that night in approaching Amadeo Diallo. He then said that the jury should find the officers responsible for intentionally killing Amadeo Diallo and for displaying a depraved indifference for human life. This is at the very heart of the 2 second-degree murder charges filed against the officers. He also said the officers jeopardized not only Amadeo Diallo's life, but the lives of others in the building because they had fired, according to him, wildly that night of February 4th of last year.
He presented the scenario from Diallo's point of view, which was interesting, and he said it was likely that anyone in Amadeo Diallo's position might think that they were being robbed and that they had plenty to fear, seeing these 4 very large men, these cops, there we go, these cops holding out a shield, but to Diallo it might have appeared some piece of metal that they were throwing at him. And he said, even, did you consider that Diallo, did you consider that Diallo might be frightened of you? And he recalled that the officers responded no. All right, we are in recess for the day. Court resumes tomorrow, and with the charge of the jury, and that begins at 9:15. We'll, of course, be back to bring you the very latest from the Diallo trial. Stay tuned.
They say one's cows are mad, a monstrous slur. They say one's dentistry is diabolical. Looks fine to me. But there's one thing they say which is absolutely bang on. One's television is brilliant.
If one wants the best of British television, one gets BBC America. Contact your local cable or satellite provider or go to bbcamerica.com.
One wants one's BBC.
I'll for you, madam.
Quite.
This is the New York Living Marketplace Report.
I'm Paul Messina. If you're still in search of the city's best in Midtown, the Zagat Marketplace survey suggests 2 top flower shops, including Zeze. Described as an East Side Garden of Eden, customers say it's delightful to step into this shop for what they call divine, highly creative arrangements, fantastic orchids, and gift baskets. Another reason people recommend it? Knowledgeable service. Zeze gets a 29 for quality, 26s for both variety and service, and a VE for very expensive. Customers say if you're prepared to pay, then Zeze is the place to go when only the best will do. Another Midtown flower shop recommended by the Zagat Marketplace survey is Rennie, designed for entertaining. Customers say this is the best for everything from an original bouquet to the setting for a lavish event. And they describe the Rennie style as an exotic, vibrant color palette coupled with classical elegance. So what are the ratings? On a scale of 1 to 30, Rennie gets a 28 for quality, a 26 for variety, a 25 for service, and a VE for very expensive. Paul Messina, New York 1.
Fox Searchlight Pictures and Time Warner City Cable invite you and a guest to attend a special advanced screening of The Closer You Get.
Wanted, American women to share in the great outdoor life. Indoor facilities also available.
God bless America.
You really think they're going to come, don't you?
Why wouldn't they?
You'll be dead before those American girls arrive. Sometimes the closer you get to something, the harder it is to see it.
Pick up your complimentary screening pass for The Closer You Get at Fish's Eddy on 19th and Broadway.
This is the Bell Atlantic Community Calendar, featuring upcoming events around the 5 boroughs.
You're watching New York 1. It's 5 o'clock.
I'm Roma Torrey with the New York 1 Minute. Closing arguments are over in the Amadeo Diallo police shooting trial. The judge will charge the jury tomorrow, and then deliberations will begin. Prosecutors say Diallo had a right to be in his vestibule and that he never stood a chance. Defense attorneys argued the officers made an unavoidable mistake, but that it was not a crime. Former police officer Charles Schwarz takes the stand in the second Abner Louima police torture trial. Schwarz told the court he was not with the Haitian immigrant in the bathroom of the 70th precinct when he was assaulted. Police are looking for this teen, one of 2 suspects who they believe is responsible for at least 15 fires in Bushwick, Brooklyn, including a blaze that left a mother and son fighting for their lives. A defeat for the Giuliani administration, state court ruling the city cannot evict the homeless from shelters if they fail to comply with workfare. And more than 1,000 new police officers are sworn in.
You're watching New York 1. News all day.
And we'll have more on the day's top stories in a moment, but first, a check of our exclusive 5-borough weather readings. You're looking at live conditions at our weather sensors in each of the 5 boroughs today. Bright skies and nice conditions outside. Highs will be climbing into the low 50s today. Tonight, we're mostly cloudy and cooler with a low dropping to 35. As for tomorrow, mild again with a mix of sun and clouds. The high even higher at 55 degrees. We'll have complete details for you, including the 5-day forecast coming up in 10 minutes. Closing arguments are over in the Amadeo Diallo police shooting trial, and now it is between the judge and the jury to finish the case. The judge will be charging the jury first thing tomorrow morning at 9:15. We'll bring that to you, and then the case goes to the jury, who will be deliberating a verdict. Now, a lot happened today. We heard from 4 defense attorneys, and last we heard from the prosecutor, Eric Warner, who presented in just about 2 hours a very forceful closing argument. He started off holding up 2 pieces of paper with the number 4 on one page and the number 1 on another page. He said that symbolized 41 bullets. He said it also symbolized 4 against 1. The 4 he referred to as trained cops wearing protective vests, armed against a defenseless Amadeo Diallo in the vestibule of his home, and he said he never stood a chance. He also said Diallo didn't do anything wrong and that they, referring to the cops, didn't do anything right. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
If what was being done to him was reasonable, if what was being done to him was right and okay and fair and appropriate, what is there that you've ever heard about that man that wouldn't suggest he'd respond in kind? They're reasonable to me, I'm reasonable to them. They're fair to me, I'm fair to them. They're appropriate to me, I'm appropriate to them. They deal properly with me, I deal properly with them. They respect me, I respect them.
Warner challenged a number of key issues that were raised by the defense earlier in the day, among them the lighting situation. The defense claiming that the lighting was, that the vestibule was dimly lit. But Warner said that that wasn't what was part of the testimony from the witnesses, and he went on, he listed some half a dozen witnesses or so who all said that the lighting was sufficient that night. He talked about the police commands, the four officers, the four defendants